The bony opening for the nose is called the piriform aperture. Inside it there are two nasal cavities, a right and a left, separated in the midline by the nasal septum. To see more of the septum and the nasal cavity, we'll look at it in a skull that's been divided just to the left of the midline.
Here's the bony part of the nasal septum. It's formed by this part of the ethmoid bone, the perpendicular plate, and by this small bone that we haven't encountered up till now, the vomer. The lowest part of the septum
remove the septum to get a good look at the lateral wall of the nasal cavity. The roof of the nasal cavity runs along this line, rising to its highest point along the length of the cribriform plate. It is formed by the maxilla and by the palatine bone. Here's the divided left cribriform plate, this projection above. Here are the conchae again, superior, middle, and inferior. There are several openings in the lateral wall of the nasal cavity. They're partly hidden by the conchae. We'll see them in a minute. The lateral wall of the nasal cavity is formed partly by the maxilla, partly by the ethmoid bone, and partly by the perpendicular part of the palatine bone. Further back, to get a better look inside, we'll divide the skull in the frontal plane along this line. There's a lot to see here. Let's get ourselves oriented. Here's the hard palate. Here's the floor of the anterior cranial fossa. Here are the medial walls of the orbits. Here are the two nasal cavities. The septum dividing them is a little off-center, which is not unusual. The roof of each cavity, formed by the cribriform plate, is very narrow. The medial wall of each nasal cavity, formed by the septum, is smooth and featureless. So is the floor. By contrast, the lateral wall is marked by a number of features, most notably by these three delicate bony projections, the conchae, also known as the turbinate bones. This is the inferior concha, this is the middle concha, this is the much smaller superior concha. The three conchae partially divide the air passage into three parts. As we've seen, the bony passage for the nasolacrimal duct starts here. The nasolacrimal duct, which is quite short, passes downwards and backwards to open beneath the inferior concha. Here's its opening. Here's the back of the orbital cavity. Below it is the hollow space in the maxilla, the maxillary antrum, which we'll look at later. At about the level of the floor of the orbit, the nasal cavity becomes much narrower. The narrowing is caused by the presence of this collection of small hollow spaces, the ethmoid air cells. We'll see more of these in a minute. Bone that overlies each sinus has been removed. Here's the cavity for the right frontal sinus. There's a left one, too, on the other side of this partition. The frontal sinus extends upward behind the lower part of the forehead and also, to a variable extent, backwards between the roof of the orbit and the floor of the anterior cranial fossa.
Here's the cavity for the right maxillary sinus, also known as the maxillary antrum.
It extends backwards to the part of the maxilla that borders the pterygomaxillary fissure. It extends downwards almost to the root of the upper molar and premolar teeth. The medial wall of the maxillary sinus is also the lateral wall of the nasal cavity. Its roof forms a large part of the floor of the orbit. The sphenoid sinuses occupy the central part of the sphenoid bone. This opening has been made to show the right sphenoid sinus. To see it better, we'll look at the skull divided in the midline. Here's the right sphenoid sinus again. Above the sphenoid sinus is the floor of the anterior cranial fossa and the sella turcica. Behind it is the basilar part of the occipital bone. In front of it is the high part of the nasal cavity. Below it is the roof of the nasopharynx. Lastly, we'll come round to the front was divided in the frontal plane. All of this is the ethmoid bone. This part, the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid, forms a large part of the bony nasal septum. This upward projection is the beginning of the crista galli, which rises up in the floor of the anterior cranial fossa. On each side of the crista galli are the cribriform plates, which we've seen already from above and from below. The most lateral part of the ethmoid bone is this paper-thin layer, the lamina papyracea, which forms this part of the medial wall of the orbit. Between the lamina papyracea and the upper part of the nasal cavity are the ethmoid air cells, as we've seen. The superior and middle conchae are also parts of the ethmoid bone. The ethmoid bone is joined to the frontal bone above the maxillae below, and the central part of the sphenoid bone behind. To look at the collection of small cavities that contain the ethmoid air cells, collectively referred to as the ethmoid sinus. These extend from just behind the nasolacrimal duct all the way back along the medial wall of the orbit. As we've seen already, the ethmoid air cells lie between the medial wall of the orbit and the lateral wall of the upper part of the nasal cavity. Here's the frontal sinus cavity. Here's the maxillary sinus cavity, seen through an artificial opening. The frontal and maxillary sinuses both open in this complex area beneath the middle concha, which we need to look at in more detail. In a dry skull, there are two large irregular openings from the nasal cavity into the maxillary sinus, separated by this flake of bone, the uncinate process. In the living body, all of this opening and much of this one are closed off by soft tissue. The real opening of the maxillary sinus is back here. If we look in from in front, we can see that the opening is quite high on the medial wall of the maxillary antrum. The frontal and maxillary sinuses open into the nasal cavity, not directly, but into a narrow side chamber located here, called the infundibulum. The infundibulum isn't apparent in a bony specimen. We'll see it when we look at the soft tissues. Now we'll look at the openings for the other sinuses. The sphenoid sinus opens into the nasal cavity here, above and behind the superior concha. The ethmoid air cells, which are up in this region, have several small openings into the nasal cavity. Some of these are behind the middle concha, some of them are below it. Here's the piriform aperture and the nasal septum. Here are the posterior nares, or choanae. Here's the inferior concha, the middle concha, and the superior concha. Here are the superior meatus, middle meatus, and inferior meatus. Here's the cavity for the frontal sinus, the maxillary sinus, the sphenoid sinus, and here are the ethmoid air cells. Here are the cribriform plates, the uncinate process, and the vomer. Here are the frontonasal duct, the openings for the maxillary sinus, the sphenoid sinus, and the ethmoid air cells, posterior and anterior. Here are the openings for the nasolacrimal duct and the sphenopalatine foramen.